Okay, great. Well, thank you again. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of the R2v3 Code of Practices. We're discussing revision 2.3 of the Code of Practices today. Some housekeeping items in case you haven't attended a webinar before or if it's been a while. All attendees are muted for these webinars through GoToWebinar, but you can utilize the question tab on the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen to type any questions that you might have. Feel free to type those at any point during the presentation. I will save the questions for the end, but you can type them as they come up for you so that you don't forget. We are recording today's webinar, so a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording will both be available through PJR's website sometime after the presentation for you to refer back to. We're also having another iteration of this webinar Tuesday, August 13th. In general, you can reach out to PJR at pjr.com for inquiries. At the end of the presentation, I'll also have my contact information on the screen should you have any technical questions you'd like directed to me. I forgot to introduce myself on the very first slide, but my name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Program Manager at PJR. And the EHS department does include our R2v3 clients and the R2v3 standard. So again, welcome. The agenda for today's presentation is pretty short and sweet. We will begin by discussing the publication details, the implementation requirements for this latest revision 2.3 of the Code of Practices. Every time that it is revised, it does come with an associated deadline to implement the requirements. We'll spend the majority of the time in today's webinar talking about some of the key changes in the Code of Practices. You can refer to the Code of Practices, the revision history at the bottom of the document to find an extensive list of everything that was changed, but today's presentation will focus on some of those key changes. I already mentioned about the question tab, so we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation, and you can type those in as we go. Okay, so to start off, the Code of Practice revision 2.3 was published a few months ago. It was published on May 15th of this year, and the certification bodies like PJR were given 90 days to implement the requirements of the revised Code of Practices. So the deadline for CBs to implement the changes is August 15th, 2024. That deadline is rapidly approaching, which is why this webinar content is timely. For audits taking place on or after August 15th, these changes will be put into effect. The only exception to that deadline is the implementation of a new appendix, Appendix G. For anyone who is not familiar with Appendix G focuses on the PV, the photovoltaic modules, or the solar panels. So this is a new addition to the R2v3 standard that was published earlier this year, not the subject of today's webinar, but the implementation deadline of August 15th of this year does not apply to existing clients who want to or are affected by the Appendix G addition. So when we get to that section of the Code of Practices changes, we'll talk about how the deadline to add Appendix G is different. No need to panic and think that you need to implement that new appendix over the next couple of weeks. I did also want to share that the Code of Practice itself is available to download from CERI's website. They have a document library page on their website, which houses the current version of the R2v3 standard, where you'll find reference to the Appendix G section that's been added. The rec has also been revised to account for Appendix G, and of course, the subject of today's webinar, the current version of the Code of Practices, which is 2.3. So if you haven't already downloaded those, I certainly encourage you to go ahead and do so. Again, that is through CIRI's website on their document library page. You do have to sign or agree to some licensure or waiver information to be able to access that library, but it is available at no cost. Getting right into the meat and potatoes of today's webinar, the key changes. These are not introduced in any particular order, so we will just dig right in. One of the key changes related to or located in the revised Code of Practices is, of course, Appendix G. So while the standard was revised to include Appendix G, what it means, what it requires, the Code of Practice has been revised to dictate the transition process, what adding Appendix G will look like for affected clients, how the audit time is to be calculated, how the scope is to be worded. All of those things are found in the revised version of the Code of Practices. The prescribed transition method for existing clients who will add Appendix G only required for clients who process solar panels. This isn't something that all R2 clients need to add. So this is only for affected clients, but the Code of Practices dictates that adding Appendix G will be required to involve an on-site scope extension audit. So adding Appendix G, auditing Appendix G for the first time for existing clients will not be able to be done remotely or virtually, as some audit types are allowed by the Code of Practices. So keep in mind your transition, your scope extension to add Appendix G, that part will be required to be on site. And the deadline for existing clients to add and qualify for Appendix G, if they are affected by this change, is January 31st, 2027. You can certainly add Appendix G sooner than that, but that is the deadline to add the requirement. Failure to meet that deadline for affected clients will result in suspension of certification. There's a grace period in which you can be suspended before ultimately your certificate is withdrawn. That grace period is 90 days. So you've got plenty of time to plan how you want to go about that transition activity. There is obviously quite a bit of detail in the Code of Practice. In the meantime, if you're not transitioning, it talks about how you manage those PV modules, how it might affect your supplier or downstream due diligence assessments, what evidence you would be required to provide in the meantime. So that can be found in section 12.2 of the Code of Practices. Moving on to the next key change. Version 2.3 of the Code of Practices introduced a Code of Ethics policy, which will be implemented and managed by CIRI. So this will require annual commitments from certification body personnel as relevant to their ability to impact the R2v3 certification processes. Of course, this includes auditors, but it is not solely limited to auditors necessarily. So affected personnel within each CB will be required to agree to and adhere to the R2 Code of Ethics policy that CIRI is working on implementing. Also, we have two new sections under the competency requirements for certification bodies. This doesn't impact our clients all that much, but it is still one of the key changes, so I included it in the slides. Those two new sections include the subject of conflicts of interest and performance. Those are found in sections 3.4 and 3.5 respectively. The conflict of interest section is exactly what it sounds like, making sure that there are safeguards against reciprocal relationships to ensure that R2v3 Audits are as objective and fair as possible. Performance, on the other hand, will focus on monitoring the auditor's performance to ensure they are meeting series expectations, auditing to the extent of the standard, no more, no less, and that they present a robust understanding of the R2v3 requirements. Certainly, if Siri has any feedback, they would share it directly with the certification body who is using the auditor to conduct audits so that any performance concerns could be rectified. The Code of Practices version 2.3 also introduces two new subjects which are required to be identified as major nonconformities if an auditor encounters them during an audit. This section already existed in the Code of Practices. It is 7.2.4 in this version of the Code of Practices. It's a bulleted list of items, like I said, that would automatically be called or quantified as major nonconformities if they're found during an audit. And what this version of the Code of Practices does is add two more items to that list. The two new items, again, not an inclusive list because 7.10.4 has quite a bit more. The two new ones are failure to maintain the EHS, and in some cases, quality management system certifications that are prerequisites to R2v3 certification. Those certifications do need to be accredited by an AB that is an IAF signatory. So if a client failed to maintain those, if their certificate was no longer accredited or lapsed for whatever reason, this would be fodder for a major nonconformity according to the Code of Practices. Another item is failure to audit legal compliance periodically and or effectively. So if legal compliance gaps are identified, that is a major nonconformity as well, according to version 2.3 of the Code of Practices. There are a variety of other items on this list. Again, it's section 7.10.4 if you want to familiarize yourself with those, or if you're questioning the grading in an audit that you have. Certainly other items could escalate to the degree of being called a major nonconformity, such as multiple iterations of the same type of gap, a previous NCR that wasn't effectively resolved from the previous year's audit, things like that. This isn't an exhaustive list of what might be called a major, but NCRs of these natures are required to be called majors by the Code of Practices. The last bulleted item on this slide is the introduction of the concept of a probationary SERI license agreement. This is for new clients, not existing clients, at least currently. This concept applies to new clients seeking R2v3 certification for the first time. This applies at SERI's discretion and may be enacted if a given company or company owner or anything along those lines, if SERI identifies a history of issues or concerns significant enough to affect their eligibility for certification, then SERI might enact this opportunity that they left open in the Code of Practices to issue a probationary SERI license agreement instead of the run-of-the-mill, normal or typical SERI license agreement. And what this means is that following certification, more frequent monitoring will be required. Rather than an annual audit, this probationary SERI license agreement will require semi-annual monitoring. Instead of having one surveillance audit per year, the subsequent 2 years after achieving certification, we would have 4 semi-annual surveillance audits to ensure that the certification body is checking in more frequently to ensure ongoing compliance. This might be a temporary measure that Siri then, upon verifying the performance, decides to replace with a normal Siri license agreement, thus lifting that semi-annual monitoring requirement. This is brand new, so I can't speak to how this has worked in the past. It hasn't happened yet. So again, I want to stress that this is for new clients, not existing clients, at least currently. As it's written right now in the Code of Practices, this would just apply to companies pursuing initial certification that are on Siri's radar, not in a good way. The last couple key changes that I want to introduce today before we get to the question portion are on this last slide. So overall, we see slight increases in the audit durations prescribed by the Code of Practice in the audit time calculation tables for a variety of appendices and the subbrackets within the appendices. I won't use a blanket statement and say that they were all revised, but the vast majority of them were revised. And those are found in Table 5 of the Code of Practices Revision 2.3. There are a series of tables within that section, depending on the employee count for the organization. You would be looking at a specific table. We have core requirement time, we have process requirement time, and that's where we would focus on Table 5 for the R2 process or appendix audit time calculations. So you'll see almost across the board slight increases in audit duration. And these are prescribed by Siri through the R2v3 Code of Practices. These aren't subjective on the part of the certification body. So you should see R2 time calculations be essentially the same, regardless of which certification body you are utilizing for R2v3 at least. And this, again, going back to the implementation deadline requirements for the new Code of Practices, this will be for audits where their audit duration is calculated after the implementation deadline, or at least that's how PJR decided to implement the changes. So audits calculated after August 15th will use this newer time calculation requirements. It's not necessarily related to when the audit takes place, but when the audit time calculations are performed. The revised Code of Practices also allows a greater degree of flexibility with the drafting of the audit plan to account for integrated audits. A lot of our clients, our R2 clients, not all, but a lot of our R2 clients do undergo integrated audits in the sense that PJR would hold not only the R2v3 certification, but also the prerequisite certifications, whether that is RIOS or ISO 14001 and 45001, potentially also ISO 9001. Being able to integrate the audits allows for a difference in audit time. Time is added for non-integrated audits to ensure that all of the requirements are being covered. By allowing a greater degree of flexibility, this affects the auditors more than clients, but the audit plans can sometimes be complex and difficult to read. So being able to simplify the audit plan creation process could help clients in a number of ways. It could be easier to understand and follow the audit plan. They may receive them in a more timely manner. It was quite complex previously prior to these Code of Practice revisions. So you'll see some changes in the way audit plans are created and potentially the flow of those integrated audits as well. The last bulleted point I have on this slide is the version 2.3 of the Code of Practices introduced a discount for core requirement time only. So this wouldn't apply to process requirements or appendix audit time, but the core requirement time can be discounted for R2 facilities who are already certified to Australia and New Zealand's 5377 standard, or in Europe to the 5625 standard, 50,625. The previous version of the Code of Practices did not allow any discount whatsoever. So this is a recent change, and it relates essentially to the degree of overlap between the R2v3 requirements and these two standards referenced here. I don't know if at this time PJR has any clients that are affected by this change. And again, I need to stress it only applies to the core requirement time, not the process requirement time. But certainly that's something that you should make clear on your application or your documentation for PJR if this affects your organization, so we can ensure that you do go ahead and receive that discount if you're eligible. Okay, so those are the key changes at a high level. As I indicated, there are a multitude of changes in this version, in this revision, and the full revision history is found at the bottom of the Code of Practices, which you can download through CERI's website on the document library page. It goes point by point, I believe, in order, going through the document from beginning to end of every instance of a revision. If you review those changes in more detail and you do have questions, I have my contact information on the next slide, but please feel free, if you haven't done so already, to go ahead and type your questions into the question field, and I will do my best to answer those. A few more things I want to reiterate before we do that. Today's presentation is being recorded. A copy of today's slides and a recording will be available on PJR's website for you to reference. I'm also offering another iteration of this webinar before the implementation deadline. That webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, August 13th. If you want to recommend this to anyone and have them tune in, or if you want to check back in and see if we've added any content or provided answers to questions that weren't asked during today's session. I'm going to go ahead and review the questions that we have here so far. And I'm not in any rush. If you're still typing, please take your time. I did go through those at a very high level. We can get into more detail if anyone has questions. We have a question about the probationary CERI license agreement, the need to check every 6 months. Correct. The intention there is that the audits themselves will be conducted semi-annually rather than annually, as is most often the case. It doesn't mean necessarily that the probationary license will be issued every 6 months. I can't speak to exactly how that process will look. My understanding currently, as we don't have any that fall into this category yet, is that the probationary CERI license will look different than the regular license. It will include formal notification to the certification body to ensure that we are doing those semi-annual audits until or unless notified by CERI that that's no longer required and that a regular CERI license has been granted. So the audits would be semi-annual following initial certification. The stage 2 likely would just be one audit, as it typically would be, and the subsequent surveillance audits and recertification audits would be semi-annual rather than annual. Thank you for your question. Okay, in case anyone is waiting for my contact information while they're typing or getting ready to hop off, I have my email address on this last slide. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Program Manager at Perry Johnson Registrars. You can contact me directly at amatthews@pjr.com, or as always, the PJR email addresses I shared on the previous slides. If you would like to discuss any technical questions, or if any other questions come up as you review the Code of Practices in preparation for your next audit that would be affected by those changes, I can make myself available and do my best to assist. It appears that that's it for the questions, actually. So feel free to tune into the next webinar to see if there's any different content. You guys took it easy on me today. Those are the key changes for the Code of Practices revision 2.3. I encourage you to download it and the revised copies of the standard and the rec if you haven't already done that. And I do appreciate your time with us today. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you soon at a future webinar. Thanks.